My first question to you is, what have been the findings of Global Critical Infrastructure Report? So if you can share some highlights with us.
Sure. As you probably know, last year's report was indicating there were quite a few companies that were under assault, whether it was exfiltration of data or distributed denial of service attacks. And what we found this year is that it has definitely increased, and that at the same time, the number of security protections or precautions have not necessarily increased by as much. And so, again, extrapolating from that, what we feel is that we will continue to see critical infrastructure under attack. There is a great deal of money to be made from stealing intellectual property from these companies. There is a great deal to be made from nation states who want to bring down these networks and cause denial of service or some type of disruption, whether it's malware infiltration or it's a denial of service attack. So whether it's extortion, exfiltration, or sabotage, we are seeing it all increase.
And what is there in the report about India?
So India, for example, has increased in terms of the amount of extortion that has happened. There are quite a few companies who have been under assault from denial of service attacks as well as from exfiltration, and that many of them are concerned about their preparedness, either at a company level or at a country level, to really be able to withstand these types of attacks. Not necessarily surprising, and particularly because many of the companies around the world feel much the same way. I think there's a lot of hesitation of not knowing where the next threat is going to come from. I think that when you think about the attacks that have happened in the recent past, they have, to some degree, lied dormant. And so the question is, do we have something within our organization today that we're just not aware of? Now, interestingly, there did seem to be a lot of confidence with Stuxnet in particular that it has been completely eradicated, particularly among the Indian respondents, which is interesting because what we're saying is that something like the Stuxnet malware, which was looking for a specific configuration, can lie dormant. So can any of us really be certain that the malware is not there and be certain that we're not under attack, although I would call that maybe a more silent attack. In terms of some other interesting kind of high-level views is that while there is concern that the government may not be prepared, there is also some level of confidence that if policy or legislation existed, that would somewhat mitigate these issues, which I think is interesting. So as you go around the world, there are a number of beliefs. One is that regulation will solve it all. And to some degree, you might feel that the Indian respondents may feel that way. That, you know, if you can have regulation, that you can get the budgets that you need to better secure your infrastructure. But the flip side of that has been that when there's too much focus on regulation, that there is too much focus on the checkbox, complying with something, not necessarily thinking about how to secure the network. And so some of the attention may be diverted in the wrong direction. On the other hand, if you talk to executives around the world, they will tell you that while their requests for more security budget and more headcount, for example, to deal with some of these security issues, have been somewhat ignored, when regulation is put in play, they can certainly get the budgets that they've been requesting, because all of a sudden it becomes this highest priority to be able to quote-unquote comply. And so I think, you know, regulation is kind of an interesting discussion as we move around the world and decide how we're going to address this problem.
We are essentially focused on governance issues, so I want to understand, how do you define this critical infrastructure with respect to the government?
So the government is challenged because they need the number of resources that can really try to mitigate, particularly here in India, because so many of these responsibilities fall on the government. They're not all privately owned. So getting a handle on, number one, what are the vulnerabilities? what is my risk posture relative to what I've already gotten in place. And so one of the challenges is being able to have that contextual understanding. It's not just that a new vulnerability has come out in Adobe Flash or a new vulnerability has come out on IE browsers, but instead, do I have compensating controls already in place so I don't have to chase that latest vulnerability down? So I think that will continue to be a challenge for any government to really get a handle on that and always have that contextual perspective. The other thing is, and many governments around the world are talking about this, is having the cybersecurity talent in-house that you need so that you're not reliant upon outsourcing all the time necessarily. And so some of this came up yesterday in FutureGov in the conference there, and whether the government will move to cloud computing and will outsource more and more. But one of the things that we've been talking to a number of the governments about is really think long and hard about what you want to accede to an outside institution. Understand where your data is, keep your data in-house where it's under your control, and then decide what other services might be beneficial for you to outsource to the cloud, for example, because there are certain services that would make sense. So you've got the manpower issue. You've certainly always got cost issues for any government. Governments around the world are clearly suffering from budget challenges. And then you've got this keeping up with the vulnerability picture. So those are some of the things that we hear most common across governments.
And if you look at the critical infrastructure, there are air traffic control, power grid, there are multiple such institutions in India. Just want to understand what will be the impact if something goes wrong in these cases.
Well, if you look at the types of threats that there are, and those, the three main ones that we talked about, whether it's sabotage or exfiltration of data or extortion, they all have a different level of risk for any government. So one, sabotage. In the case of air traffic control or power grid, I think it's very clear. We're going to lose our power, or maybe even lose our power in certain segments of the grid. Maybe not catastrophically across the board, but in certain segments. And the same can be said about air traffic control, and you can go through the various scenarios. From the standpoint of sabotage, if they're successful, obviously it's a tremendous hit on the government to pay off the demands or to try to deal with it themselves and fear the repercussions of that. I think what's interesting as we look around the world at this third category, which is really this exfiltration of data, that's a harder one, because how is that information now going to be used? If it's a nation state trying to get ahead from an economic advantage standpoint, we were talking at the conference yesterday, is this kind of economic cyber war. What impact does that have to your businesses, to your government? What decisions have been made that could be now impacted because they've got certain amounts of information that could be advantageous to competitive advantage? So that's one element of the situation with exfiltration. In other ways, it could be exfiltrating data that tells them more about these critical networks. So more about what you're running on your control systems in your air traffic control, what you're running on the control systems of your power grid, that they can then use for a future attack. So it could have ramifications in the way of sabotage. So I think the exfiltration one is almost scarier because you don't know what that outcome is going to be. And you certainly don't have, in many cases, a knowledge of when this malware is being planted to do this exfiltration. When's it planted? How long has it been there? What information has it now stolen and exfiltrated out of the government network? I was interested in seeing, we had Operation Aurora, which was, in my mind, looking at something along the supply chain route. If you can exfiltrate information about source code, for example. We learned a lot about how source code software needs to be improved in terms of its security protections. But now what do you know about the code that's out there of some of the suppliers that are providing you capabilities within your government infrastructure? And then you had this recent slate with Night Dragon, which was exfiltrating information relative to energy and oil and gas around the world. So what's going to be the next target? Now, interestingly, the government of Australia had a recent attack, and they targeted the email system, as you're probably aware. But I think the other interesting commentary coming out of that one is that they feel they were after the mining data. That it wasn't necessarily trying to infiltrate the government, they weren't necessarily trying to sabotage the government networks, but instead that they may have been after information about their mining operations. So I think, you know, there's a lot still to be learned about what the purposes are of these exfiltration exercises or cyber attacks, if you will, on the exfiltration side.
And what has been the trend in this direction? Say last year also you did a report, this year also. So how is the trend changing over the years?
Sadly, there's been an increase in the number of attacks in all three vectors. I think the scarier thing is the trending, you know, has increased, but the question is, what do we still not know? So in the case of Night Dragon, as an example, some of these operations have been going on back to 2009. So this is 2011. What other ones are we going to hear about that have been in place for some time that we didn't know? And I think one of the challenges is, particularly in the critical sectors, where control systems, for example, have been running proprietary protocols on closed networks, it hasn't been as high of a priority. It hasn't been as much of a concern, because the thought is they're not IP-based, they're not facing the public network, they're not touching the public network in any way. So the question is, you know, are we really that much at risk? But we are connecting more to IP networks, and I do feel we're much more at risk. So what don't we yet know about what else is out there? Aurora was another one that had been going on, but luckily Google was on top of things and were able to warn, you know, other companies that may have not even been aware that they were under attack. And so I think there's more to come. So even though we saw some trending upwards, I'm just wondering, longer term, what more are we going to learn?
And what was the geographical origin of these threats? Is it
You know, that's always an interesting one, and you've probably been studying the security sector for quite some time, so a lot can be done for these attacks to look like they're coming from other locations. So that's the reality. And the way that I look at it is, you know, I learned a lot being in the government. And one of the things that I learned to appreciate is that there is what they consider all-source intelligence. So the way that I look at this is that as security vendors, we can provide what our data points are. So we saw it coming from this IP address or this domain name or, you know, on this date at this time. To me, that's where governments need to marry that information up with whatever intelligence that they have access to that's on the classified side. So did I have indicators from other sources and other means so that I can marry that up with what Mcfee is providing us, for example, to get a clearer picture if we really feel that it's coming from one country or another. And I think that's really up to the government to decide. Who is the perpetrator? Who is really the nation state? And I think the other thing that's going to be interesting, you know, along those lines is that we know there are quite a few tools and technologies that have been traditionally used by cyber criminals for purposes of financial gain. So the question is, you know, with these cyber criminals really honing their skills over all these years, you know, some very well known for bulletproof hosting and others known for malware development and so forth. The question is, will nation states, for example, go out and hire these experts to really develop customized solutions for what they're doing and then just pay those cyber criminals, or will they be home growing their own? There are, you know, schools of cyber techniques and tools and so forth. So will they be homegrown by a particular nation state to leverage against other countries? That's another interesting one I think will be played out over time, and we'll learn more.